Right, the purpose of these following videos is to give you an overview of the medicine course, to try and narrow the medicine course down with the content to about 30 minutes to an hour. Obviously, before the lead up to your exams, whether it be my school or another school, it's really important that content is key, and then you do some practice exam questions based around this. So this is aimed for Edexcel paper 1, medicine on the Western Front and medicine through time. And this video is going to focus on medieval medicine, 1250 to 1500. Now, in this video, I'm going to be going through the cause of disease, treatment of disease, and prevention of illness, while also looking at the case study of the Black Death in 1348. So the first thing we need to understand is that the cause of disease in the years 1250 to 1500 was very different due for a multitude of reasons. And this is mainly because in the years 1250 to 1500, life in Britain was very, very different. And it was mainly focused around religion and the secular control of the church. So disease and medicine all had a lot of control based around this. So you must understand what the many different explanations of disease were in the years 1250 to 1500. So firstly, we have religious explanations. Now, regardless of what we think about these, this is genuinely what people thought in the years 1250 to 1500. So firstly, if you committed a sin, then you could be given an illness. It was God's way of punishing you. And it is sort of shown that one of the main illnesses that you could be given is leprosy, which is a skin condition. And this was one especially in which the Bible stated you could get if you did something wrong in your life. Next, if there was a famine that caused malnutrition, now malnutrition is when you starve or don't get the right nutrients, it was because of God. When people recovered, it was because a miracle had taken place. So again, if something bad was happening in the world, it was because of God, either testing faith or punishing people for doing something wrong. The concept of blaming sickness on God also acted as proof of God's existence, proof of the divine. As I just previously mentioned, leprosy was included as an illustration of a punishment. So it started as a skin disease, followed by paralysis and death. Fingers and toes would fall off, body hair would drop out, and ulcers would develop in and out of your body. So lepers were treated severely harshly in communities because it was represented in the Bible. People were scared of lepers and they had their own leper houses to remove them from society. As we said, disease was mainly seen as a result of sin. It wasn't the only reason, but basically it was one way that the church controlled people by basically saying you've got to live a life abiding by the Bible or you could get sick. And this is mainly because most of what everyday people learn was through the church. It was the center of formal learning. So everyday society all circulated around the power of the church. And one of the big things that had a massive impact on medicine was the church also discouraged dissection. They believed that if your body was cut open, that you could not go to heaven. So the concept of religious explanation is there for all to see. The next thing we're going to look at the concept of astrology and supernatural. So alignment of planets was considered important when you were born. People believed that the planets aligned at certain points and possibly struck down areas of illness. Look at 1348. Astrology became very popular because that's what people blamed the Black Death on. Physicians would look at star charts, looking at when you were born to when you were ill, to look at what was wrong, to try and identify it. Now, obviously, this isn't something that the church did like, because the church frowned upon it, because it's too close to predicting the future. It's too supernatural for the control of the church to be able to handle. However, astrology was a supernatural explanation for disease because of the concept of looking at when you were born, the month you were born, the impact that would have, the planets and stars having an impact on illness. But the church frowned upon this idea. You've then also got rational explanations. Now, rational tends to be something which is easy to explain. We've got to remember that a lot of these ideas were limited in, well, they was non-existent in terms of scientific understanding. So a lot of the ideas were still based from the ancient world, the Greek and the Roman times, especially those of Hippocrates and Galen. So we had the theory of the four humours. Greeks thought everyone had a mix of four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. And basically, people became ill when their humours became imbalanced. So to make people better, they had to balance it out. Now, people believed, now in terms of your four humours, that combination of your age, your family, and your circumstances usually combine to make one of your humours stronger than others. So there was this concept that our body has an imbalance which could make you ill. That was the concept developed by Hippocrates. The theory of opposites was later developed by Galen. This aimed to balance the humours by giving patient the opposite of their symptoms. So if you had too much phlegm, which was linked to water and cold, you should eat hot peppers to balance out what was going on with your imbalance of humours. Now, the key thing is, it was a very popular idea because it explained every kind of illness, physical or mental. It was supported by the church, because the church educated the majority of people. This is all the majority of people knew. So beyond the religious explanation, you did also have rational explanation that the four humours in your body would make you sick if they became imbalanced. Then we've got some other explanations. So we've got miasma. Miasma was a very popular explanation all the way through to around the mid-1800s. The concept that bad air was believed to be filled with harmful fumes. Now, Galen and Hippocrates did say that swamps, corpses, and other rotting matter could transmit diseases. But remember, medicine is very difficult to prove anything without the scientific concept. And this is why the vast majority of progress happened in the industrial period. It's not saying that we didn't have the ideas early on, it was just very hard to prove them. You also had urine charts. Now, although this isn't a direct cause of disease, it was an easy way to diagnose. So physicians didn't blame people's urine for making them sick, but they did carefully examine it to make sure their diagnosis was spot on. And they thought it was one of the best ways to check on the balance of the humours. So they would sample a patient's urine, they would look at the smell, the taste, the colour, and that would allow them to make their diagnosis. So although it's not a cause of disease, it was a medieval form of diagnosing the patient, which really helps, especially if we then manage to compare it to the modern period and look at the change in diagnostics, which you might get in the exam, explaining the difference in diagnostics of illness from certain years to certain years. So now we've got to consider this. In regards to the cause of disease, what caused the ideas to be this way? Why did people not think more about developing the ideas? So when we look at this concept, we must look at factors. Now, the thing about this medicine course is there were factors for change, but also factors for continuity. Continuity means staying the same. So the first thing we've got to understand is one of the biggest reasons why these ideas were the way they were was because of the church. The church didn't want change. We lived in a very conservative society where people accepted what they were told because it was all they knew. The church strongly discouraged anyone from criticising the four humours. So a great example of this is Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon criticised Galen and he ended up excommunicated, sentenced to a life in hell. That would be a lot scarier for people in those days. The general thing that people try to say to me before is, why don't they just kill them? Think about the religious concept. Is that the right thing to do? Absolutely not. You've then got the science and technology, or the lack of it. The lack of science means that new knowledge was limited. The physicians and medical students basically tried to fit into old theories rather than looking at new. And why could they not look at new? Because the church said they couldn't. The attitudes, people had a strong belief in God. The reason people were scared to look beyond what was there was because they were so scared of going to hell. Then you got individuals, Galen and Hippocrates. Galen was very popular with the church, and his work was widely promoted, which meant when it came to new ideas, it was very tricky to move away from it, especially when we get to the Renaissance period. And then the government, they didn't really get involved at this stage. They spent more money on war. There was no money for medical breakthroughs. So that's the first concept of the cause of disease. If you wanted to pause the video now to make a mind map on just the cause of illness, you can. The next section is going to focus on treatment of illness, and then we're going to expand it further. Right, so the next thing we must look at is treatment of illness. Now, again, a lot of the treatment of illness links to the cause, similar to the prevention. There's a lot of similarities in why people treat themselves or prevent illness in certain ways. Now, to put it into context, it's really clear to understand that when we get ill today, doctors will look at the symptoms, make a diagnosis, and treat the patient. If a patient catches a chest infection, the treatment prescribed will be to attack the germ. Now, we can't do that in the medieval period because physicians break down each symptom because they believe that each symptom represented the humours. So conflicting remedies may be provided because ultimately they're not sure what is causing it. The cause of the illness is the four humours or a religious reason. That's not necessarily going to help the patient in terms of treatment. So you did have religious and supernatural treatments. You've got healing prayers, praying for a special mass to be said. You could fast. You could go on a pilgrimage, which is a long religious walk. You could touch a holy relic when you go on the pilgrimages. You could light a candle and hope that people pray for that, and chant incantations. You then got the supernatural treatments, which again, as I mentioned previously, the church may not have been a big fan of, but you look at your horoscope, when you were born, which allows the treatment. You look at the alignment of planets to make sure that herb gathering, bleeding, purging, operations, cutting hairs and nails is all done at the right time to allow you for your treatments. So you look at the positioning of things like the sun and the moon and the planets, and that ultimately helps you develop your next stage of treatment. Was it effective? Remember, this is what they believed. So in an exam, if you were asked about the effectiveness of treatment, then you've got to have that opinion that although it seems maybe silly to us, it genuinely was at the time effective to the people that were alive because this is what they believed in. You've then got purging. You've then got ways to balance the humours. So we're going to look at a range. So these are called humoral treatments. I'll just add that in the very corner. So what we've got here over the next few slides is a humoral treatments. Again, lots of these we've gone through, lots of these you would have covered many times. So it's just a whistle-stop tour. So the first one, bloodletting, phlebotomy. This is the most common treatment for imbalancing in the imbalance of the humours. This is what they believed where they could remove bad humours by removing some of the blood, usually done by barber surgeons and wise women, never done by physicians, because remember, very religious people could not cut the body. So you could cut a vein. This was the most straightforward. You'd have blood charts to show which veins you should be cutting for certain illnesses. You'd have leeches, where leeches were collected, kept hungry, placed on the skin. You might have 10 hours worth where the leech would be sucking away and this would hurt. Better for the elderly, but would scar you for life. Then you've got cupping. Skin was pierced with a knife, pin, or a fingernail. A heated cup was put over it, which drew blood out the skin, which was used for women, children, and very old people. People believed that certain areas treated different illnesses. So, for example, back of the neck was good for eye trouble. So bloodletting, really key. Cut a vein, leeches, cupping. That's what we're looking for in terms of effectiveness of illness. This was very popular. Then you've got purging. So a lot of people also believe that four humours were imbalanced because of what you eat. So the way to do this is by purging your digestive system to get rid of any leftover food. So you could do that through vomiting, and this was called an emetic. This is where you could take a herbal remedy to make you vomit. Now, you had to be careful there because it could be poisonous, so you had to vomit quickly. You had emetics there which said strong bitter herbs, so scammony or parsley. The bitterness would make you vomit. Laxatives would be common to make you go to the toilet, but then some people would need help to purge. And the physician would administer an enema. And one of the most famous was known as a clyster, where they would mix water, honey, oil, wheat, soap, and herbs, squirted up inside the patient's anus using a greased pipe. The patient rubbed their stomach, and hopefully that allows them that ultimate purge to be able to clear their digestive system. You've then also got remedies, so Humoral drinks, Humoral infusion, to drink, sniff, or bathe in. Aloe vera was very popular. The main remedy was called the theriaca, which was a mixture of 70 ingredients, which was the most popular mixture from apothecaries. And you might even be told to eat different foods. So a very popular dish called blanc manger was recommended because the ingredients were warm and moist. Then you had bathing, so warm baths, draw in the heat. If we think about what people say when they're ill today, they have a bath, a hot bath. This happens in the medieval period to dissolve blockages. It steams out impurities, helps the joints, but some people believe that it could treat things like paralysis. For example, bathing with a dead fox would allow people to be cured because of the speed of the fox. So there were some very invalid treatments, ones that we know just wouldn't work. However, there were different aspects because of the beliefs at the time. You've then got medics, which again are very important to understanding the change that happens over time. So again, not going through these in too much detail, the first one you'd have is the physician. Now, during the Middle Ages, the physicians were the most skilled. And you could kind of argue that they are our modern day doctor, but we don't use the phrase doctor. The main thing that the physician would do is they would diagnose illness and recommend a course of treatment. They didn't treat themselves. This would be left to the less educated individuals. So what was their job? So they'd look at a sample of the patient's urine, feces, and blood. They'd look at astrology charts, and they'd look at the humoral tendencies of the patient. So the concept of the physician is to diagnose, not treat. But they did go to university for 7 to 10 years. They were the most intelligent and skilled people available at this time period, but they were very expensive. Not many people would be able to afford a physician. Most of the treatment will be carried out by less trained and lower paid people. Most physicians were religious clergymen who were forbidden for carrying out procedures. So ultimately, they could not operate because they were religious people. So who are we talking about with the less trained? So you've got the apothecaries who mixed herbal remedies, good knowledge of healing power of herbs, because they studied manuals such as the Materia Medica. Just underline that because it's a very important key term. They had a huge amount of knowledge, so it was passed down. If you were born into an apothecary family, the chances you would become someone who mixed herbs for your career. But it wasn't seen as skilled or as knowledgeable as physicians. Physicians would prescribe the medication, and apothecaries just mixed the remedy. But apothecaries were comparatively cheap. They did sometimes prescribe poison, which went against the ideas of the physicians that they should do no harm. It's really important that all physicians must swear a Hippocratic oath saying they will not harm their patient. But apothecaries were not bound by this rule, so they could not be trusted to do the best for the patient, and they didn't have to attend university. So, looking at the weaknesses of the apothecary, although they were cheaper and more accessible, they could do damage because they didn't have to swear the Hippocratic oath. You've then got surgeons. Now, surgeons, barber surgeons, who are we talking about? Least qualified. All you really need to be a good barber surgeon is a sharp set of knives and a steady hand. They would do small surgery, such as teeth extraction. Some could do your amputations, broken limbs, remove an arrow, but really in Britain, they were very limited to skill. Beyond Britain, yes, there were some skilled surgeons, but within Britain, it was very limited. So barber surgeons, they would be the least qualified and possibly do more harm than good. Before I go on to hospitals, just quickly women. So women in home care, what we need to understand is although there were other options for treatment, lots of people decided to be cared at home. Women would care for their relatives. They would make the patient comfortable, prepare foods to balance their humours, mix herbal remedies, and also women would grow the herbs. They're responsible for the garden. There is some suggestion they carried out small surgeries, but it's impossible to tell because the records are very patchy. So women were probably the most popular option because people felt most calm with them. Now, hospitals are really important because the change in hospitals over time could well be an exam question for the 4 marker. So the number of hospitals were on the rise. By 1500, there were 1,100 hospitals. Now, Bury St Edmunds had 6 hospitals, a very religious area. But hospitals did not treat the sick. They offered hospitality, hence the name hospital. The church ran the majority of hospitals. Now, what we need to understand here is that people would leave money in their wills to build hospitals, and it was all based around the concept of looking after their soul. The concept of hospitals here is there were places to rest, recover, and sleep. They would be clean, they would have their bedding changed regularly, patients would share bed, but insane people, pregnant people, terminal people were turned away because if people didn't survive in a hospital run by the church, the idea of God might be questioned. So that's all we need on treatment. Now we've got 3 more slides to really develop medieval medicine. Now to do this, we're going to look at prevention, we're going to look at the Black Death, and then we're going to look at what factors limited, prohibited change in this time period. So prevention of illness. Remember, the key thing is treatment, you've got it. Prevention, you're stopping it. A lot of the preventative methods were similar to the treatments because, again, it linked to the causes. This is why this concept of the cause is far easier. So how did people prevent themselves from getting sick in this period? So firstly, the church. You'd pray, you'd confess, and you'd pay a tithe, which is 1/10 of your wage. You'd have a good diet. Because the humours were thought to be in balance with digestion, when you eat and what you eat were very important. You were told not to eat too much. So because of the fear of digestive problems, people would purge on average once a fortnight by vomiting or using laxatives. So even if they weren't sick, they'd purge fortnightly. As it says there, Hippocrates recommended using an emetic once a fortnight to use and to purge your digestive system to prevent yourself from getting sick. Keeping yourself clean was another key reason, hygiene. It was important to focus on bodily health. So there was a set of instructions called the Regimen Sanitatis, which was provided by physicians to help patients have a good standard of living. So, for example, moderate exercise, don't overeat, get a reasonable amount of sleep, regularly bathe, and then it's some more absurd advice. like being friendly with your neighbours, stay away from barking dogs, and don't have too much sex. Hygiene also depended a lot on bathing. So if you stay clean, then you will religiously prevent yourself from getting sick. But really, only the wealthy could have a private bath. You did have public baths, which people would go to for a fee. Now, obviously, as time went on, they became less fashionable. Poor people swam in rivers, but the key thing is, no matter how rich or poor you were, everyone washed their hands after their meal. And then purify the air, make the air clean. How do we do that? It's to prevent, miasma. So sweet herbs, lavender, carry around a posy of flowers. Some local councils did try and deal with it, but at this time it wasn't aware of how damaging miasma could be or unclean areas. So some did try and clean their towns, in the medieval period. But whereas other local councils actually said that leaving smelly things outside would scare away miasma. So really, in the grand scheme of things, it really did depend on where you lived and their approach to it. But the key thing we must understand that a lot of people thought preventing illness was better than anything else. As it says at the top, there was a huge focus on following everyday regimes to stop yourself getting sick in the first place. With every course, there's always a key topic, which I'll make very clear in my other 3 videos, which are to follow this. The key topic for medieval medicine is the Black Death. So with this, you need to know the cause, treatment, and prevention. The chances it will probably come up in a bullet point, or you might get a specific focus on this question. So we need to go through it. Again, a lot of it's very, very similar. So in 1348, there was a new disease that reached England. It spread from the Far East along trade routes, arriving in Sicily, and it spread across the whole of Europe, killing 2/3 of the population. It was one of the worst outbreaks that we still talk about in history today. It didn't matter. The key thing with this was, in the past, the rich could possibly buy more effective treatment, etc. But the Black Death did not discriminate. If you caught it, you could expect to die within a matter of days. So with this, the causes, the treatments, and preventions are all very similar. So causes, God, people sinning, the alignment of the planets. It was God's plan to make people behave themselves more. People believed it was miasma, mainly maybe because of an earthquake that happened, which released poisonous fumes from a volcano. Filth in the streets could be another cause that people believed, but then also some people blamed the Jewish population. So there were a multitude of causes that people blamed, many, many causes. Treatments, similar to what we've talked about. Confess your sins, pray for forgiveness. Some people thought it was inevitable. Once you've got it, you were meant to get it because you've not lived a good life. You bleed, you purge, you burst the buboes, which will be very difficult because they'd be quite hard and difficult to pop. Confess your sins, pray. Some people just decided to enjoy their lives because it was inevitable that they were going to die. And then preventing. You pray, you fast, you pilgrimage, you become a flagellant, you whip yourself to say sorry. You run away from the air. You avoid breathing in miasma. You avoid bathing, which was another very popular idea, because when you bathe, your pores open, and people believed that the Black Death would go into your pores and kill you. Other people thought, listen to cheerful music, don't do anything sad, don't visit family members who had the disease. So some of this is very, very common sense and very rational. But because they had no idea what was causing the Black Death, the treatments and the preventions were very variable. So just remember, when you're doing this, that it's all very similar to what you've already studied in this course. The last thing I'm going to go through, actually, before that, it's important that we look at the government act, because you might get a comparison question on the government from the Black Death to the Great Plague. So local authorities tried to prevent the plague. They put quarantine laws in place to stop people from moving around. People that came to a new area had to stay away from everyone else for 40 days. Authorities started to quarantine houses, but not fully. There was a consideration of banning preaching and religious processions, but they couldn't enforce this because of how religious the time was. Probably would have caused a lot of uproar. Some local authorities stopped cleaning the streets because they thought that the smell of rotting bodies would scare away the plague, because if it was caused by miasma, that could help. The last part of this video is, why did medicine not change during this period? So I will always stand by this, that if you got a question like this in the exam, it would be a dream question, whether it be a 12 or a 16 marker. However, if you are vague with your knowledge, that will limit the AO1 knowledge that you can present, which as a result will impact the AO2 explanation in helping you answer your question. So some of the key factors, remember, go back to factors if you're ever stuck. The church. The church is one reason why medicine did not change much in this period. But you can't just say it's because they were religious. You go back to what we went through. So it had a lot of land. It was very powerful. The Bible said that God controlled every aspect of life, so God sent disease. The Pope, bishops, and priests said that everything in the Bible was true and you couldn't challenge what it said. So no medical ideas would be developed because nobody was allowed to. And the church, the biggest thing is the church supported the ideas of Galen. Galen had said that the body had been created by one God, which made all the parts fit together perfectly. Even if there was a mistake in Galen's work, the church would blame the person, not Galen. So the only dissection that could happen in this period was a vivisection, which was on a criminal. If they noticed different things about the body, the person would be blamed. That should really show the impact of the church in this time, the impact it had on everyday belief on medicine. Then you've got your education. So the Articella, one of the main books in this period, were written by the church. The church controlled education. Physicians were trained by the church. So ultimately, and another thing we've got to understand is physicians had to be at uni for so long, they ended up dropping out or they couldn't afford it. So there were only a handful anyway. Everything they did was read the books of Hippocrates and Galen's. They had to believe everything that said, so they weren't allowed to experiment, they weren't allowed to dissect. They would watch surgeries, but if something was different, as I've just mentioned, they would blame the person, not Galen. Nobody tried to look at about the human body. Nobody tried to look at beyond what Galen said, which is why in the Renaissance period, which we're going to talk about in the next video, it's a big step forward. Attitudes. People respected tradition, the church, the way the doctors, people had great respect for traditional. It was a conservative time. They did what they were told. This meant that it was hard for new ideas to spread. Books were written by hand. Doctors weren't trained to challenge because they had the respect for tradition. And tradition in this period, Galen and Hippocrates. Individuals. There wasn't anyone that made a breakthrough. The key thing with individuals is Galen and Hippocrates. What impact did they have on everyday life and everyday medicine? They were dead. Don't write they're alive in the exam. The key thing is lack of dissection. Nobody could find out about the body. Everyone believed the ideas of Hippocrates and Galen because there was evidence to prove their ideas, because you could see it. For example, if you were sick, you might see bile. If you were ill, you might see blood. So the four humours you could see. Phlegm is a common occurrence when you're unwell. So the fact that their ideas could be seen, there was no reason to challenge it. And then the government. The government did not get involved. The king did order the towns to be cleaned, but no taxes were collected. So in terms of medical breakthroughs, they were not going to happen for as long as the church was so influential in everyday society. As I say, in terms of application of what questions you could get questions on the reasons for lack of change. You could get a comparison question on hospitals or doctors or prevention. The difference question is very popular to include the medieval, because it's a good way to show that you understand how 2 time periods have changed. So that's your medieval medicine video. Have a look through. Make sure you're only revising what you know at what you don't know at this stage. And if you do need just a quick recap, have a look over this video. Thanks very much.